All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa ba'd. Last week we had discussed the history of tafsir and its development, or we started discussing the history of tafsir and its development. Inshallah, we want to continue that discussion today. And you will recall that in addition to our discussion about how the field of tafsir itself developed, we also were discussing how the sciences of the Arabic language developed and the very important role that plays for tafsir. And in fact, that the Qur'an was actually the reason and the impetus for preserving the classical Arabic language and for developing these different sciences for analyzing the classical Arabic language. So, the next development that we want to discuss is related to both development in the sciences of the Arabic language as well as the development of the science of tafsir in particular. You'll remember that we mentioned that one of the distinct features of the Qur'an is that it is mu'jiz, that it is, as scholars say, as we say in English, that its language is considered to be miraculous. Or in other words, it is a linguistic miracle. So every prophet was given a miracle to show to people the truth, to prove to people the truth of his message. And the miracle that was given to our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the main miracle that he was given, because his message is the final message, after him there will be no messenger, and so his sign had to be an eternal sign for all the generations of mankind until Yawm al-Qiyamah. So the sign that he was given, the miracle that he was given, was the Qur'an. And scholars have taken a host of different approaches to explaining what makes the Qur'an miraculous. Generally, these discussions have focused primarily on the high language and eloquence of the Qur'an. And so this has been seen as the most fundamental aspect of what makes the Qur'an a miracle. And so this is something that is generally agreed on by all scholars and all experts in the Arabic language, that the Arabic of the Qur'an, that the language of the Qur'an is very unique, very deep and very eloquent. But it is difficult to explain what exactly makes the Qur'an miraculous. If you look at it, it is, composed of the same Arabic letters and the same Arabic words that all of the Arabs use, or all of the Arabs at the time of revelation used. So, what is it that made it a miracle? Is this something that can be proved that it is miraculous? And so, this is a field of study of the Qur'an that was also developing from a fairly early stage. And it culminates, or I shouldn't say that it culminates, because this is a discussion and a field of study that has carried on really even until our times, with people trying to explain what makes the Qur'an a miracle, or trying to analyze the miraculous nature of the Qur'an. Because if the Qur'an, if the miraculous nature of the Qur'an is one of the greatest hujjas for the truth of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, then it's necessary to explain and to understand what makes it miraculous. But one of the most important developments in the attempt to answer this question, the Qur'an's language is miraculous, but what makes it miraculous, was an attempt put forward by Al-Imam Abdul Qahir Al-Jurjani. And Abdul Qahir Al-Jurjani is a Sunni Ash'ari, But those who contributed to attempting to answer this question before him, you'll find some of them are Sunnis and some of them are Mu'tazila. Some of them are from the Mu'tazili sect. But Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani was a Sunni. And so he came after many attempts had been made to explain what makes the Qur'an miraculous. And he wrote, at the end of his life, he wrote a book called Dalailul I'jaz, the evidences of the miraculous nature of the Qur'an. And he says in the introduction to Dalail al-I'jaz that basically I have been attempting to arrive at the answer to this question. I've devoted my whole life to this. Al-Jurjani was an expert in the Arabic language. His specialty was in the Arabic language. So he has works written on Arabic grammar, on Arabic literature, on Ilm al-Balagha, the science of rhetoric, as it had developed up to his time. And this book that he wrote at the end of his life, Dalail al-I'jaz, is basically the ultimate work that he produced. It is the final work that is the culmination of all of his life's efforts. He says, I spent my whole life attempting to arrive at the answer to this question. And so the answer to this question that he arrived at, how can we explain, how can we show, how can we demonstrate that the Qur'an is in fact miraculous, or I should say, what is the tool that we can use? What is the tool we can use to show that the Qur'an is miraculous? He came up with this book, Dalail al-I'jaz. And in Dalail al-I'jaz, he developed what came to be known as a new science. Came to be known as a new science, one of the sub-sciences of Balagha, which is Ilm al-Ma'ani. And so basically, the basic idea of Ilm al-Ma'ani, obviously this is a big fat book, but to sum it up, the idea of Ilm al-Ma'ani is that Arabic, because of the unique grammatical structure of the Arabic language, basically the Arabic language allows, anytime you want to express a certain idea or a certain meaning, that there's a host of possible sentence structures that can be used for that one expression. And so, a person who is baligh, a person who is eloquent, when attempting to express a certain meaning, will choose, out of all of the possible sentence structures that are available to him, the one that is best capable of conveying the meaning that he intends to convey. And so, the idea of Ilm al-Ma'ani, or the idea of his book in Dalail al-I'jaz, is that with this, what comes to be known as Ilm al-Ma'ani, that the analytical tools that he's developed for analyzing the grammatical structure of the sentences and how those different grammatical structures are used for expressing different meanings, we can show the eloquence of the Qur'an. And then a person who is familiar with Arabic literature and the highest of Arabic literature being the Arabic poetry, and particularly the Jahili poetry, because the standard that the Arabs were judging by when the Qur'an was revealed was comparing it to their poetry. So he says that you can read the poetry and apply these analytical tools to poetry, and then you can read the Qur'an and apply these same analytical tools that analyze the grammatical structure of the sentences, because obviously by this time the science of grammar, as we said, was already well developed. In fact, was well developed from the time of Sibawayh, centuries before. Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani being in the 5th century Hijri, the 400s. So we can look at this grammatical structure and analyze how well the particular grammatical structure chosen in any given sentence in the Qur'an expresses the meaning that is intended in that place. So, as an example, we say Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. In another place in the Quran, Allah says, Lillahi alhamdu Rabbil Alameen. Lillahi alhamdu Rabbil Alameen. So reversing the order. So the general meaning is the same, that all praise belongs to Allah, Lord of the worlds. But the structure of the sentence has changed. In one place we put the word alhamd first, in the other we have reversed the structure. So what is the purpose of putting alhamd first here in Surah Al-Fatiha and putting lillahi alhamd, putting Allah's mention of Allah first in this other place? And so the idea of ilm al-balagha is that the person who is a baligh, natural native speaker of the Arabic language, from his immense familiarity with the language and its different structures, he intuitively, particularly if he's an eloquent speaker, he will intuitively use the sentence structure that best gives the subtle connotations that support the meaning that he's trying to get across. At a basic level, both of these structures have the same meaning. Both of these sentences have the same meaning. But each one, there's a subtle difference. So one of the fundamental principles that the ulama of Balagha have devised, or Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani has highlighted, is that in the Arabic language, the Arabs will, when they want to make something the focus of discussion, and because the sentence structure is quite versatile, there's quite a good bit of liberty to change sentence structure, much more so than there is in, for example, in the English language. So, given that this versatility exists in terms of how you can structured sentences, they say that the eloquent speaker of the Arabic language will put that point first, that he wants to make the focus of the discussion. So when Allah says Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen at the beginning of Surah Al-Fatiha, what is he making the focus of this discussion? Alhamd. So then the question arises, well, why not say Lillahi alhamdu Rabbil Alameen, as he said in another place? Obviously, what could be more important to focus on than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And this is the very beginning of the Quran. Why not focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So then the tools of ilm al-ma'ani, or this qaida of ilm al-ma'ani tells us that alhamd is now here what is the focus of the discussion. And so in attempting to understand the surah, you want to make a determination, why has this been chosen to be the focus of the sentence, of the focus of the discussion? Why alhamd why is alhamd the focus of the discussion here in this place, in this ayah in Surah Al-Fatiha? Because we know, and we've seen this even in the Quran and in another place, it doesn't have to be. And Allah Himself has used Lillahi alhamd. So there must be a reason why this has been made the focus here, and Allah Himself has been made the focus in this other verse. And so it's not important at this moment. Inshallah, this is something we'll discuss when we get to Surah Al-Fatiha. But it's not so important what is the exact answer to that question. But the idea is that this is the idea what ilm al-ma'ani does. But for example, we can say that Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, highlights that He is worthy of all praise. And if He is worthy of all praise, then He is perfect in every fashion. And so the focus here is praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and showing that all praise belongs to Him, to show His perfection. So this is the theme of this discussion. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin, that all perfection belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the question is, so here Alhamd has been made the focus. Or, for example, Alhamd has been made the focus because the discussion here is not simply about the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is deserving of praise, but that we are praising Him. And so it is an expression of our praise. And so the point here is that praise encompasses thanks. And the greatest, and Allah is due thanks for all of the blessings that He has given us. Allah is due thanks for all of the blessings He has given us. And the greatest blessing that He has given us is the Qur'an. And so it's appropriate to begin our recitation of the Qur'an by expressing our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this great blessing that He has given us. So the maqam, the context here is a context where the focus is on expressing gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so our attempt to understand why is this the focus here would lead us to discover subtle connotations, subtle meanings that are not immediately obvious. Now, the important thing to understand here is, and this is something we mentioned before, that the Arabic of the Qur'an is not the Arabic that is spoken today. The grammatical endings are not used anymore in common speech as they were by the Arabs in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So these sorts of subtle meanings, because this sort of usage was still common in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, would have been recognizing them would have been second nature to Arabs in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, because it's their language and this is how they use it. For those who come after, it requires formal study. So you learn the sciences, you formally study the grammar of the Arabic language, then you formally study the sciences of Balagha, and then you use these tools and come back and study Arabic literature, and then attempt to reach a point where you have an appreciation of these sort of subtleties of the Arabic language, the way that the native speaker of the Arabic language in the time of the Prophet ﷺ did, so that you can then appreciate the Balagha of the Qur'an, and so that then you can realize that the Balagha of the Qur'an, the eloquence of the Qur'an, is perfect. It is a level of perfection that is not achievable by a human author. Because anytime you have a human author, he will always have something where he'll come back and he'll look at what he has written, no matter how excellent an author he is, no matter how excellent his command of the language is, he'll always come back and look at what he's written and say, you know what, this sentence, let me move this here. Let me move it here. Why did I express this meaning this way? Let me express it this way. And so you'll always find that, you know what, there's some nucks here. There's some deficiency here. There's some flaw that can be improved on. There's some meaning that can be expressed in a deeper fashion. And this is when you have a human author. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you study the Qur'an, no matter how much you study the Qur'an, you will always find that its choice of words and its choice of sentence structure and its choice of how it's composed, the meanings that are being presented, is perfect. This was his answer to this question of what makes the Qur'an mu'jiz. Now, I should just mention in passing that this answer that he gave, this is not the only answer, but it is the culmination of all the attempts that were being made before him, and it is one of the most impressive attempts. And this is one point about the Arabic language and what makes the Arabic language unique, and why was the Arabic language chosen for the revelation of the Quran. This feature about the versatility of its grammar and the versatility of the sentence structures that it allows, as well as other features of the Arabic language that I'm not going to get into, make the Arabic language meaning the Arabic of the time of the Prophet ﷺ, not necessarily the slang that is spoken today, makes the Arabic language capable of expressing meanings and carrying rich meanings in its words, in its expressions, in a fashion that you will not find in other languages. And so this is what makes the Arabic language the language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to reveal the Qur'an in. So the choice of the Arabic language for this person, for this final revelation, is deliberate. And this is why the Qur'an highlights the fact that we have revealed it as an Arabic Qur'an. This is a deliberate choice. This is not incidental to the revelation of the Qur'an. It's not just because the Prophet ﷺ happens to be an Arab, so the Qur'an happened to be revealed in his language, just as prophets were sent to other nations before, and so the Qur'an happened to be revealed to them in their language because it's addressed to their people. Because the Qur'an is not, it is a message, it was a message addressed initially, the initial audience was the Arabs. This is true. But it was chosen to be the final revelation that would be revelation for all of mankind, and to serve as a miracle and a sign to all generations of mankind until Yawm al-Qiyamah, which was not the case for any book before it. And so the Arabic language at that moment in history, and the level that it had reached at that moment in history at which it was revealed, and the Arabs as a people at that moment in their history were chosen for this revelation due to great wisdom from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he saw that this language is the most fit for this revelation, and that these people who then became the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the best generation of all of mankind. This is a very important point. Best generation of all of mankind. Allah chose them knowing that they have certain qualities that qualify them for that. And He chose this language at this moment in its historical development because He knew that this was the best language for this purpose, and that these people were the best people, the most capable of carrying and fulfilling this mission. So this is a very important point, highlighting the importance of the Arabic nature of the Quran. Now, what does this have to do with tafsir? Lovely exploration of ijaz of Quran and what makes the Quran miraculous. Imam al-Jurjani's book is a wonderful book. He also has another book that's also very important called Balagha, which forms the foundation of the other major subscience of Ilm al-Balagha, which is known as Ilm al-Bayan. Ilm al-Bayan, basically, just to give you an idea, Ilm al-Bayan focuses on exploring the use of figurative language and metaphors and imagery, and how this type of language is used to express meanings. So this is actually something that Imam Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani had explored before writing his final work, Dalal al-Ijaz, which explores what came to be known as Ilm al-Ma'ani, which basically and this is something that's very unique about this book. It is basically a new science that was invented at his hands for the purpose of answering this question. But what does this have to do with tafsir? Well, what it has to do with tafsir is that the next important development in the history of the science of tafsir is Al-Kashaf by Imam Al-Zamakhshari, Abul Qasim Al-Zamakhshari, who is, we said Al-Jurjani was a Sunni Ash'ari. Al-Zamakhshari is a Mu'tazili. So, Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Kashaf, Imam Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Kashaf, he sort of, you could say, shifts the focus. He shifts the focus of tafsir, or he adds a new element to tafsir that is not really a focus of tafsir before him. And we can really say that when we look at the history of tafsir, there are certain important developments. We discussed some of them in our last lecture, but one of those important developments is this book, Al-Kashaf, this Tafsir of the Qur'an by Imam Al-Zamakhshari. So basically, we're now entering a new era of tafsir, which is we basically have there's tafsir before Al-Zamakhshari and tafsir after Zamakhshari. So this is one of the very important developments in tafsir, that Al-Zamakhshari takes Ilm al-Bayan and Ilm al-Ma'ani. Remember, we said Ilm al-Ma'ani is basically Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's Dalal al-I'jaz. And Ilm al-Bayan is basically Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's Asrar al-Balagha. So in these two works, he's laid out these sciences as theory. And one thing that's interesting is that even though he says that the entire purpose of my book, Dalal al-I'jaz, is to explain what makes the Qur'an miraculous, when he actually explains what are his analytical tools that he's devised, he actually only has a handful of examples from the Qur'an. Most of the examples that he uses to illustrate these principles that he's devising for analyzing the grammatical structure of sentences, most of the examples that he actually analyzes are actually examples from Arabic poetry. So he doesn't actually, even in this book, even for his examples, he for the most part doesn't actually apply it to the Qur'an. As Zamakhshari comes along and takes these sciences and says, I'm going to apply them to the Qur'an. And so I think one thing that we can say about what Zamakhshari did is that tafsir before Zamakhshari was mainly focused on answering the question, what does the Qur'an mean? This is the fundamental purpose of tafsir. What does the Qur'an mean? So Zamakhshari is not eliminating this element of tafsir, because obviously that is, if you don't have that, then you don't have anything. If you don't know what the Qur'an means, then it's just words. Or even not even words. If you don't know the Arabic language, it's just sounds. So he adds to this, what does the Qur'an mean? Another question, which is, so Mufassirin before him are answering, what does the Qur'an mean? He touches on what does the Qur'an mean, but then he adds to it, how has the Qur'an expressed those meanings? And that analysis of how the Qur'an has expressed its meanings adds another layer, because in the process of discovering how is the Qur'an chosen to express its meanings, we also discover additional layers of meaning. Secondary and tertiary layers of meaning that build on the initial fundamental meaning. So for example, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen means all praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds. Well, why did he express it this way? Why did he use this sentence structure? Why did he use this expression instead of this expression? Answering those questions will reveal additional subtle connotations that may not be immediately obvious when reading tafsir or when reading the Qur'an. Okay, so if we look at the tafsir of Al-Zamakhshari, just briefly, I'll just give some examples to illustrate some of its features. Al-Zamakhshari builds on the Mufassirin who came before him. He builds on the Mufassirin who came before him, But the tafsir that he wrote is actually a very brief, very summarized tafsir. Before he wrote this tafsir, he actually had written a partial tafsir of the Qur'an where he goes really in depth. He goes really in depth into exploring the balagha, exploring the meanings. This is not actually, this initial writing that he wrote, as far as I'm aware, has not reached us. We don't have it. But this is mentioned by his biographers that he had written this. And then after that, he wrote, and at the very least, we know that that what he had written, he had explained Surah Al-Fatiha. And he possibly explained more than Surah Al-Fatiha, but we know that part of his explanation deals with Surah Al-Fatiha, this detailed explanation that he wrote, which, as I said, has not reached us. But I've seen some scholars actually quote from it and refer to it as Al-Kashaf Al-Kabir, the major Al-Kashaf, which, is not, as I said, is not a complete explanation of the Qur'an. So he then wrote, when he wrote Al-Kashaf, he wrote it in a very brief fashion. So it's not a very long tafsir. So what he does is basically, he builds on the tafsir literature that exists before him. And we also mentioned that there was this literature that was written by linguists. So linguists who were writing linguistic commentaries on the Qur'an, grammatical analysis of the Qur'an. He has all of this in front of him. And so he will summarize, he will present in a very summarized fashion, well, what is the interpretation of this verse? Oftentimes, he will pick an interpretation out of multiple interpretations, and he may or may not allude to the different interpretations in very brief fashion. The grammar of the Arabic language, because it is so versatile, oftentimes any given ayah of the Qur'an, there actually be different opinions amongst the grammarians as to this word is in this grammatical case, why? This word is in this grammatical case, why? What is the grammatical function of this word in the sentence? What is the grammatical function of this word in the sentence? So what he will do is he doesn't actually go deep into those differences of opinion and examining each opinion and explaining which one he prefers and why he prefers it. He will usually pick one. He goes ahead and picks the one that he thinks is best, and then based on that, offers some reflections on the balagha, the eloquence, the rhetorical analysis of the meaning of these verses. So it's actually a very brief tafsir, and this then leads to an entire literature after him devoted to exploring these things in more depth. So people actually start writing commentaries on his commentary. Because his commentary, because it's a short text, became a teaching text. And so it became, and this is something that's very interesting, that even though he's a Mu'tazili, he belongs to a different theological school from Ahl Sunnah, this very quickly, after he writes it, becomes throughout much of the Muslim world the chosen work for studying and teaching tafsir. So Sunni scholars everywhere, in spite of the theological differences that they have with the Zamakhshari, and basically the difference between the Mu'tazila and Ahl Sunnah, or over a host of different issues. As an example, they differ in terms of how do they understand qadr, Allah's predestination, and what does it mean, and what have you. And there are other issues as well. But these theological differences exist. In spite of these theological differences, and in spite of the fact that the discussion about these theological differences is oftentimes quite sensitive, or at least scholars are very sensitive to it. In spite of this, because of the excellence of the tafsir that he had written, it was largely embraced for teaching purposes in Sunni institutions. And so from that time on, it becomes the major work that is written. Later on, we have other works will eventually supplant it, but they're works based on it. And so really what we have from his time onwards is that tafsir, and particularly the teaching of tafsir and the study of tafsir and how tafsir is taught, tends to revolve around either a Zamakhshari in its commentaries, or Other tafsirs, such as, for example, Tafsir Al-Baydawi. The Tafsir Al-Baydawi is basically a Sunni adaptation of his tafsir that is also drawing on other sources, but is very much based on Al-Zamakhshari. And it's also an excellent tafsir. So, once that becomes the standard teaching text, the Tafsir al-Baydawi, it becomes a standard teaching text, and what we find happens is commentaries then begin to be written on that. But if you look at al-Baydawi and the commentaries on it, all of this is really an extension and commentary on what Al-Zamakhshari started in terms of rhetorical analysis of the Qur'an. And I'll just give some examples sort of to illustrate. We already talked about Ilm al-Ma'ani and the example of Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Lillah alhamd. That's an example to illustrate. Another thing that you will find that Zamakhshari oftentimes does is he will analyze the word choice of the Qur'an. And this is something that Ibn Atiyah, by the way, Ibn Atiyah is actually a very important mufassir to mention. I didn't really mention him because he's a continuation of the trends that existed before him. Ibn Atiyah is actually a contemporary of Al-Zamakhshari. Al-Zamakhshari dies in 543 Hijri. Ibn Atiyah dies in 538 Hijri. Ibn Atiyah says, and both of them, he also has a very important tafsir. But it's a culmination of the trends that existed before him. Very deep, very sharp analysis of the meanings of the Qur'an and the different opinions that have been offered and the reasoning and the arguments behind each opinion. Very sharp, very deep, very insightful. One of the most important tafsirs ever written. Ibn Atiyah, in his introduction to his tafsir, he says that if you were to examine any word that the Qur'an has used in any place, and then try and search the whole of the Arabic language, which is a very vast language, as we mentioned. The dictionaries are voluminous. If you were to search the whole language and try and choose a better word in place of the word that the Qur'an has chosen, you would not find it. So this is he mentioned this as basically his attempt to answer what makes the Qur'an miraculous. Coming back to that same question. So that if you were to examine the whole of the Qur'an, the whole of the Arabic language, any word in front of you, if you were to examine what makes the Qur'an miraculous, you would find that every word that it is chosen, you could search the whole Arabic language and not find a better word to take its place. So, in tafsirs before Zamakhshari, including even Ibn Atiyah, who was actually contemporary to Zamakhshari, sometimes you will find comments on the choice of words in the Qur'an. But this then becomes a more prominent feature with Zamakhshari. It becomes a more prominent feature with Zamakhshari. So I'll just give an example to illustrate this point. In Surah Al-Baqarah, by the way, about the ijaz of the Qur'an. Usually, anytime as an author, when you write a book, you at the beginning in your introduction will mention that I've done my best, and if you find any mistakes, let me know, and don't just look at the mistakes because no one is perfect. You will mention these sorts of things. The Qur'an begins saying, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book after which there can be no better book. لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. There can be no doubt about it. Meaning there can be no doubt. It claims that it is from Allah, there can be no doubt about it. Right? In fact, it actually literally says, there is no doubt about it. Now obviously there is doubt about it. There are people who doubt it. But the Qur'an is saying, their doubt is worthless. Because it's not based on any real reason other than that they don't want to believe it. So this is immediately the Qur'an, straight out of the gate, it tells you, this book, you've never read anything like it. This is the best book that has ever been seen by mankind. So basically from straight out of the gate, the Qur'an is challenging the reader that this is the best book the most perfect book there has ever been. And so this ties into what we're talking about here now, about the i'jaz of the Qur'an. But in any case, as an example of analysis of the Qur'an's usage, of the Qur'an's word choice, we find, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, around 20 verses in, I think it's maybe verse 21 of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah says, 21, 22, something like that, 22. فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ, addressing the disbelievers and mushrikeen, addressing those who make partners with Allah, who are guilty of shirk. Allah says, فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Do not set up partners with Allah, وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, while you know all of this that has been mentioned before, that He has created the heavens and the earth, etc. You know that He is the one who created all of these things. How can you have a partner? Do not set up, it says, فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا. It doesn't say فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا مَعَ اللَّهِ آلِهَةً. It doesn't say, although this expression or similar to it has been used in the Qur'an, don't take gods with Allah. It doesn't say don't take partners with Allah. It says don't make rivals to Allah. Don't make rivals to Allah. Al-Zamakhshari makes a very interesting observation about this verse. And this is one thing that it really brings out, the quality of his tafsir. But again, if you're reading his tafsir, the uninitiated reader will read his tafsir, and he makes all sorts of subtle observations, but he does it in such a brief fashion that if you blink, you'll miss it. So you have to be a very attentive reader when reading his tafsir. So, for example, typically, the word andad is the plural of nid. I'll type it here in the box. Andad, nid. It's the plural of nid. A lot of Mufassirin before Al-Zamakhshari, when they define nid, they say that the meaning of nid is mathil, someone equal or similar to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is part of the meaning that is intended here. But a precise translation of the word nid in English, and you'll find that this is how almost all translators of the Qur'an in English have translated this verse. A precise translation of this word into English would be rival. It's not just an equal or someone similar, it's a rival. Now obviously you have to be similar to someone or equal to someone to be able to rival them. So this explanation that these scholars gave before is not wrong. But it doesn't really capture the purpose of choosing this word here. So Imam Al-Zamakhshari, when he explains it, he uses the word munawi to explain the meaning of nid. And munawi basically means a challenger, somebody who's challenging you. And this more closely captures this idea of rivalry. Now, okay, that's just the explanation of the word, but what does that have to do with analyzing the choice of words? Why use the word nid here? Something that's a very interesting observation. It's an example of the sorts of very sharp, insightful observations that Al-Zamakhshari makes in his tafsir. He says, or basically, this is what you get if you read between the lines. I don't know if he quite explicitly puts it in these terms, but when you read it carefully, you see that this is what he's saying. So some of this is in my words, but this is basically the gist of what the Zamakhshari is saying. That the Arab mushrikeen, they never claimed that their gods are rivals to Allah. They never said, we have these gods and they challenge Allah, they rival Allah. Because a rival is basically a challenger. They call them gods, they call them aliha. Aliha is plural of ilah. I'll type that here for you. Aliha, ilah. They call them shuraka. Shuraka is plural of sharik. So, shuraka or sharik means partner. So they called them deities, gods. They called them partners. They did not call them rivals. Allah has chosen to call them rivals here. Why has Allah chosen to call them rivals? The mushrikeen could very well respond, Ya Muhammad, you were claiming that we are setting up, that you're asking us, you're telling us don't make rivals with Allah, don't set up rivals with Allah. We haven't set up any rivals with Allah, we set up partners. Partner is not a rival. Partners work together. Rivals work against one another. Because that was what their conception was, that they're partners. That's what sharik means. Even if you have a business partner, it's called a sharik. And in fact, a business partnership in Arabic is called sharika. And in modern Arabic, that same word is now used for companies. So when you set up a company, it's called a sharika. It's basically a conglomerate where people are getting together to work together as partners in business. So partners are not rivals. So why did Allah call them rivals? The verses just before it, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains that Allah has created the heavens and He's created the earth and He is the one who's providing for you. What He's saying is that these things that He has done, which you acknowledge, show that His control of everything is complete. There's no room for partners. There's no room for anyone having a share in any sort of authority in the heavens or in the earth, or in provision, in sustenance, in anything. There's nothing that escapes Allah's power and His authority. There's nothing that can happen in His kingdom except if He wills it. So when you claim that He is a partner and that these partners complete one another and they're also doing some of the jobs of a god, and so this one is the god of this thing and this one is the god of this thing, what you are claiming, it's as if you're saying, we have set up these rivals who are going to try and snatch away part of what belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from Him, because He has no partners. It belongs to Him alone. The ownership of the heavens and the earth and authority of the heavens and the earth belongs to Him alone. So if anyone tries and takes it, he is trying to steal it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So but your claim, because Allah's oneness is so clear in all of these respects, your claim that He has a partner is essentially an attempt to steal away from Him a part of His ownership, a part of His authority, and give it to someone it doesn't belong to. And so this is the significance of calling them rivals. I actually spent a long time explaining this point. I think Al-Zamakhshari just alludes to it in a few lines. So if you read it, just be like, yeah, this is... And in fact, I know from my own personal experience, when I used to read Tafsir Al-Zamakhshari, earlier on in my studies, I knew how important it was, and I knew from reading later tafsirs that are building on Tafsir Al-Zamakhshari how important it was. But I would read it and it would seem very ordinary. What's going on here? Everyone said that it's supposed to be so important in Balagha, and I just don't see it. That's one of the interesting things about Al-Zamakhshari's tafsir, is that not only does he explain the Balagha of the Qur'an, he himself, in the way that he chooses to explain the Balagha of the Qur'an, is himself very baligh. His explanation is very brief in words but rich in meaning. And so that is part of the reason why his tafsir, being a commentary of the Qur'an, has its own commentaries. Because what is there in his explanation in a few lines needs to be fleshed out, it needs to be explained. Or you need to be a master of the Arabic language and a master of Balagha. In which case you'll be able to read what he's saying and read between the lines and get straight to this is what he's saying, that this response. So this is an example of what he does. In any case, as I said, after him, so much of the tafsir literature that is written after him is commentaries on him or commentaries on works that are based on his work. And so he adds this new element to tafsir that was not there before. The last point that I'll discuss about the development of tafsir, just very briefly, is in our time there was a great scholar, great mufassir named Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur. He died in 1973. He lived about 93 years, something like that. He was a Tunisian scholar, coming from a long line of scholars. And he was really one of the giants of our time. His knowledge of the Sharia and all of its various science, fiqh, usul fiqh, hadith, tafsir, and his knowledge of the Arabic language and of Arabic literature, poetry, grammar, balagha, is genuinely encyclopedic. So all these encyclopedic works that I mentioned, dictionaries in 10 volumes, 40 volumes, books of grammar in dozens of volumes, all of this library he had complete command of it. Inshallah, we'll just take a few, this point just needs a few minutes and then we'll conclude. He had complete command of it. And as well as a complete command of the classical tafsir tradition. And so having these tools and being extremely intelligent, extremely sharp, he reached a very high level of basically, you could say, ijtihad in tafsir. He was a mujtahid in tafsir. And you see this in that he's able to look at the different meanings and the different interpretations that the Mufassirin before him have given and give his own analysis and give his own conclusion. As well as, and this is one of the unique features of his tafsir, that so much of the tafsir literature, as you read it through time, there tends to be a lot of repetition because they're building on what was said before them. And so, each mufassir maybe adds certain things, certain points, certain analysis. But one of the things that really stands out with the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, and this is something that I've heard from one of my teachers, and this is something I observed myself in my reading of tafsir Ibn Ashur, and I heard it from one of my teachers, Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar, who is today in Saudi Arabia and really on a global level considered to be one of the top authorities in tafsir today. And obviously is a big fan of Ibn Ashur. He said that one of the things that is noteworthy about Tafsir Ibn Ashur is that in his discussion of almost every single ayah, he will mention some new point that you will not find in any tafsir before. Almost every verse of the Quran. He will mention something new that was not mentioned before. And so this is really, this is a work he spent 40 years of his life writing. It was published in his lifetime in a serial fashion, volume by volume. And so the early editions of it are actually in 30 volumes. And then more recent editions actually combine those volumes into larger volumes. So it's in, I think, about 12 volumes. But the edition that I have is actually based on the earlier editions that have each juz as a separate volume. They're small volumes, but it's a big work. It's a 30-volume work. So he spent 40 years to write 30 volumes of tafsir. So it's a absolutely phenomenal work. And you remember that we mentioned that one of the things that you need, that tafsir at a fundamental level requires knowledge of the Arabic language. This is the foundation. Because anytime you're analyzing a text, the foundation of that analysis has to be language. It has to be the tools of language. But then the Qur'an has certain unique features that require you also to have knowledge of other areas that then supplement that linguistic analysis. And so his encyclopedic knowledge of the sciences of the Sharia allowed him to engage in these different types of analysis at a very high level. And this is why he has so much to add to the Qur'an. And this is a confirmation of something that Ali radiallahu anhu himself said in describing the Qur'an 1400 years ago. لا يشبع منه العلماء. The ulama will never get their fill of the Qur'an, meaning there will always be new meanings to discover. ولا يخلق عن كثرة الرد. And it never grows old. It never wears out, no matter how much you repeat it. It's not like any other book. You read any other book, a few times, and it's like, okay, it's enough. Might be a lovely book, but I've read, Hamlet 4 or 5 times. That's enough. There's other works in the world. I'll go and read them. But the Quran, you have, people typically will read it every month. The Sahaba, many of the Sahaba, amongst them Uthman radiallahu anhu and others, and this is something the Prophet ﷺ had encouraged, used to finish the Quran, the entire Quran, once a week. From Jum'ah to Jum'ah. Read it once a week. So imagine if a person is doing this, this is about 52 times a year. If a person is doing this for 40 years, he will have read the Quran 2,000 times. And every time he reads it, no matter how many times he's read it, it's still fresh. This in and of itself is one of the signs of the ijaz of the Quran. But the point I want to make here is that don't be surprised when someone like Ibn Ashur, who died in 1973, we're talking about literally in our lifetime, he was basically died just a few years before I was born, is still able to contribute, make an original contribution, and at such an amazingly high level to the science of tafsir. So, this idea that some people have that, obviously this shows that, tafsir that the Quran, when it's engaged by scholars, is not like the Quran when it's engaged by other people. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, the Quran is so rich, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed it as guidance for us. He's revealed it for guidance of all of mankind. And every time you read it, it's still fresh. It doesn't feel like, oh, I've read this before. I know it's coming. There's no point now. You will read a verse, and even though you may have read it many times before, have an epiphany that it's as if I'm reading this verse for the first time. It's as if it's speaking to me. This is an element of I would say, ijaz of the Quran that any reader can appreciate. That so often you will read the Quran and find a verse and you will feel it's as if Allah revealed this verse speaking to me. So there's always wonders in the Quran to be discovered. This idea that some people have that just read the Arabic, just do tilawah, and don't try and understand the Quran because you'll go astray. This idea, particularly, it exists in the subcontinent. It's a sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's some sort of brain cancer that people have. Allah says that I revealed this book as guidance for mankind, and you are telling people that that if you try and read the Quran, you'll go astray. Apparently, it's as if this person wants to say that Allah revealed it to guide us, but he didn't do a very good job, because if you read it, you'll go astray. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Which will inshallah, we'll close with that point. Next week, inshallah, what I want to discuss, and this will be our last discussion before actually jumping into trying to look at the tafsir of the Qur'an, is now we have an idea of where we stand and everything, that all the efforts that have come before us in explaining the Qur'an and making the Qur'an accessible. And what I've given you is just scratching the surface, really. But I wanted to give you just a sort of an idea of the outline or the timeline. Next week, what I want to discuss is you and I, as average Muslims, and people who maybe don't even know the Arabic language and are entirely dependent on translations and tafsirs and lectures to understand the meanings of the Qur'an. What should our relationship be with the Qur'an? What should our relationship be with tafsir? How do I or you, as just an average Joe Muslim, how do you benefit from the Qur'an? Or how do you interact with the Qur'an? Inshallah, this is what we'll talk about next week, and that will be, I think, a good lead-in to actually starting to look at the tafsir of the Qur'an. The last point I'll make, this is a point in my notes, but I neglected to make it, about Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn Ashur is, in my opinion, the greatest scholar of our time. And he has other works that he's written. This is obviously his largest work. I mean, it's in 30 volumes and he spent 40 years writing it. He did live to be 90 years old, but even then, at the end of the day, when you're writing a work this big and spending 40 years on it, obviously there's not a whole lot of time left to write a whole lot of other works. But he does have other works, some of them very important works. But this work alone, I think, is sufficient to show that he really was the most likely the greatest, most profound scholar of our era. Ibn Ashur, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Tahir ibn Ashur. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because when we start going into the tafsir, Ibn Ashur, Al-Zamakhshari, Ibn Atiyah, some of these other works that I mentioned, I'm going to be relying on them very heavily in attempting to sort of convey to you, the listener, some of the wisdom that they've imparted, some of the deep insight that they've imparted in the understanding of the meanings of the Qur'an. So inshallah we will conclude with that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.